welcome you. You've brought us some really thought-provoking material lately, all sort of circling around this idea of vulnerability. And that's exactly what we're diving headfirst into today. We want to unpack what vulnerability truly means, why it feels like such a high-stakes game sometimes.
Yeah, and crucially, how actually choosing to embrace it can, well, transform things. The relationships, parenting, leadership.
Really, your whole experience of life, right?
Exactly. Our main guide for this deep dive is going to be Brené Brown's book, Daring Greatly. It's the outcome of years of really deep research.
Into vulnerability, courage, shame.
And empathy, yeah. How all those pieces fit together.
What grabbed me right away was how personal it felt for her. This wasn't just like abstract theory.
Not at all.
She was really grappling with it herself. I mean, that moment in therapy she describes, just blurting out, I freaking hate vulnerability. It's so raw, And I think, honestly, a lot of us can probably relate to that kind of gut level resistance.
Absolutely. Yeah. That really sets the tone, doesn't it? And it brings us straight to the core questions we'll be exploring today. Questions she was wrestling with, too.
Like, what drives this deep fear we have of being vulnerable?
And what are those protective walls we put up? Instinctively, almost.
And what's the cost? What do we lose by shutting down like that?
And the big one, how can we actually, own it, engage with vulnerability to make real positive changes in our lives?
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks then. When Brené Brown talks about vulnerability, what does she actually mean? It's a word that gets, thrown around quite a bit.
It does, and her definition has real weight. For Brown, vulnerability isn't about weakness or just like airing all your dirty laundry indiscriminately.
Right.
Instead, she defines it as showing up in the arena of your life.
And that arena could be anything, right? A new relationship, a big meeting.
Exactly. Yeah. Or pouring your heart into something creative, or maybe having one of those really tough conversations you'd rather avoid. The key thing is the willingness to step in and be genuinely seen, with all the uncertainty and risk that comes with that.
Instead of just watching from the sidelines. Judging, maybe.
Precisely. Not just commenting, but participating. That act of showing up, warts and all, that is vulnerability. That's what she means by daring greatly.
That in the arena image really does reframe it. It shifts it from passive exposure to active engagement, even if you might stumble.
Exactly. Even if you might get hurt. Now, you mentioned her initial struggle. She didn't just embrace this concept easily, did she?
No, it sounds like quite the opposite.
Not at all. The book really highlights this intense, almost physical reaction she had against vulnerability. She describes it as feeling incredibly exposed.
Like I'm coming out of my skin, I think she said.
Yes. And this powerful urge to immediately fix whatever's happening, just make the discomfort go away.
And if she couldn't fix it?
Well, then came the coping mechanisms. Things many of us probably recognize. Obsessive cleaning, eating peanut butter.
Been there.
Blaming other people, trying to control every little thing she could control in her environment.
That completely resonates. We all have our ways, don't we? Trying to find solid ground when things feel shaky.
And then there's that great contrast with her therapist, Diana, who calls vulnerability an exquisite emotion.
Right. And Brown's reaction is just perfect disbelief, maybe a little concern for Diana.
Exactly. She even clarifies, I said excruciating, not exquisite.
But
what's so compelling, despite her own gut feeling, her own research kept pointing her back to this really undeniable link.
Between being vulnerable and living what she calls a wholehearted life.
Yes. That tension, between what her head knew from the data and what her gut was screaming. I think a lot of us feel that sometimes.
So what were some of those specific triggers for her? The things that put her in that coming out of my skin state?
She pinpoints a few key areas. Fear, obviously, is a big one.
Unsurprising.
And anxiety, especially about uncertain outcomes.
Yeah.
Difficult conversations, the ones we often put off. Then there's trying new things, stepping outside your comfort zone, anything that opens you up to potential criticism.
But judgment, yeah.
And really profoundly, she includes the intense vulnerability that comes with deep love, especially for her family. That fear of something happening to them.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And interestingly, she also mentions feeling vulnerable when things are too good.
Like waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Exactly. Or when things are just too scary. It covers both ends of the spectrum, really.
That's such a key insight, that even intense joy can feel vulnerable, like you're afraid to lose it. Now, you mentioned that critical link to a wholehearted life. Can you expand on that finding that really drove her research forward?
Yeah, this was This was really the engine behind it all, even though she personally found it so uncomfortable. Her research just kept showing, unequivocally, this direct connection.
Between people who consciously embraced vulnerability
And those who lived what she defined as wholehearted lives. Lives marked by courage, compassion, and a real sense of connection.
So the data was just undeniable, even if it went against her own grain.
Undeniable. It highlighted vulnerability as absolutely essential for, well, a truly fulfilling life.
It sounds like her default mode, initially at least, might have been more about shielding herself. She talks about wearing different suits of armor.
Yeah, she describes these as various strategies she used to keep people at a safe distance, always having an exit plan ready.
Defense mechanisms, basically.
Essentially, yeah, designed to protect herself from potential hurt or exposure by not fully engaging. It's a pattern many of us can probably recognize.
And yet, despite that protective instinct, she ended up in social work, a field that demands huge amounts of empathy and vulnerability.
It is a fascinating pivot, isn't it? She admits that alongside that fear, she also had this huge heart and ready empathy. And that deep desire to connect and support others ultimately pushed her to leave a management job at AT&T.
Wow, okay.
And pursue social work. There's that great story about her boss when she resigned.
Oh, the MTV VJ comment.
Yeah. Let me guess. You're leaving to become a social worker or an MTV VJ on Headbangers Ball. It really highlights how maybe unexpected that shift seemed. But it was driven by that empathy.
So after all this research, what were the core ideas she found about living a wholehearted life? What did those people who embraced vulnerability have in common?
She identified several key things. First, that strong belief in your own worthiness. It isn't just something you have or don't have.
It's cultivated.
Exactly. Through conscious choices, daily practices. Second, the main focus for wholehearted people is living a life defined by courage.
Showing up, being seen.
Right. And by compassion for self and others, and by fostering genuine connection.
Okay.
And crucially, vulnerability was the key thing, the catalyst for all of it. It was the single clearest value shared by all the wholehearted people she studied.
Wow.
They actually credited their success in work, marriage, parenting, directly to their ability to be vulnerable.
That's such a powerful reframe. It just completely flips the script, doesn't it? Vulnerability not as weakness, but as a core strength, a key ingredient for a meaningful life.
Exactly.
Now, she also talks very vividly about her own daring greatly moment, getting invited to do a TEDx talk. How did that happen?
Yeah, so back in June 2010, she got invited to speak at TEDx Houston. And what was really unique, and maybe a bit terrifying for her,
was the freedom they gave her?
Total freedom.
Yeah.
They basically said, we love your work, talk about whatever makes you passionate, just do your thing.
She said she wasn't even sure she had a thing before that.
Right. That kind of wide open brief can be both liberating and, well, pretty anxiety-inducing.
Definitely felt that push-pull, didn't she?
Oh, absolutely. She loved the freedom, but felt huge anxiety. It pushed her right back into that uncomfortable zone, the fear of putting herself and her ideas out there.
On such a public stage. And then after the talk, things kind of blew up, didn't they? In a way she didn't expect.
Yeah, a few months later, she gets an email. Congratulations, your talk's going on the main TED website.
Wow. Intellectually, that's amazing.
Intellectually, yes. A huge honor. But her immediate gut reaction, pure terror.
Really?
She'd just gotten used to the idea of maybe a few hundred people in Houston thinking she was a bit nuts. The thought of her very personal stuff going global.
Especially when she preferred flying under the radar.
Exactly. Deeply unsettling for her. The irony, of course, of a talk on vulnerability going viral wasn't lost on her.
It's completely understandable, though. Putting yourself out there on that scale, especially with such a personal topic, opens you up to so much scrutiny.
Which brings us neatly to this idea she talks about, this pervasive never enough culture and scarcity. How does that fuel our fear of being vulnerable?
Yeah, that felt really relevant.
She argues pretty convincingly that we're swimming in this never enough culture, constantly told we're not thin enough, rich enough, successful enough. Right. This constant comparison creates this deep sense of scarcity, a feeling that we're lacking something essential.
And that makes vulnerability even scarier.
Exponentially scarier. If you already feel inadequate, the idea of exposing your flaws, risking more judgment, it's terrifying. She opens that chapter saying, after years of seeing scarcity impact families, organizations, the one thing we have in common is that we're sick of feeling afraid.
Wow.
And that fear, she argues, is tied directly to this never enough feeling. So recognizing that cultural pressure is key.
And within that landscape, she also tackles the way we throw around the term narcissism, doesn't she?
Yes, she gets pretty frustrated with how casually it's used, for everything from social media posts to just basic confidence.
She uses that Texan saying, right? You can't swing a cat without hitting a narcissist.
Exactly. But her key insight is this. Very often, narcissism is rooted deeply in shame.
Shame, really. That feels counterintuitive.
It does, but think about it. That feeling of not being good enough. So she argues, just cutting people down, constantly pointing out flaws.
Yeah.
It doesn't help. It might even make the underlying shame worse.
So the outward grandiosity, needing admiration, could actually stem from feeling inadequate deep down.
That's exactly her nuanced point. We all have this fundamental need to feel significant, valued. Sometimes those big outward behaviors are just, well, misguided attempts to soothe that inner shame.
Understanding that really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? From just labeling to trying to see the driver behind it.
Definitely.
Okay, let's tackle some common myths about vulnerability. The big one. Vulnerability equals weakness. How does she bust that myth?
She tackles it head on. Says there's absolutely no equation where taking emotional risks, facing uncertainty, being emotionally exposed, none of that equals weakness.
It's the opposite, really.
Exactly the opposite. She argues it takes tremendous courage, real strength to be vulnerable, to step into the unknown with no guarantees. That's bravery, not weakness. Vulnerability isn't the absence of strength, it's often a sign of it.
Okay, myth busted. What about the idea that being vulnerable means oversharing, just telling everyone everything?
Yeah, another important distinction. She's very clear. Healthy vulnerability is not purging or indiscriminate disclosure.
It's not just dumping your stuff on anyone nearby.
No, it's not broadcasting every fleeting feeling on social media. Healthy vulnerability, she says, is about thoughtfully sharing your real feelings and experiences.
But with people who've earned the right to hear them.
Precisely. Within relationships built on mutual trust, respect, boundaries, it's reciprocal. It's how we build deeper connections.
So intentional sharing in safe relationships, not just spilling your guts. That makes sense. How does she illustrate building that trust? The marble jar analogy is great for that, right?
It's such a brilliant analogy. Trust, she says, is built bit by bit through small, everyday moments.
Like adding marbles to a jar.
Exactly. Every time someone shows up for you, really listens, offers support without judging, keeps it confidence, that's a marble in the jar. Over time, these pile up, creating this solid base of trust.
And betrayal takes marbles out.
Right. And she stresses that betrayal isn't just the big stuff. Disengagement, not caring, not showing up when needed, those empty the jar too. It's the consistent accumulation of positive moments that builds trust, creating the safety needed for vulnerability.
That's so relatable. Those small moments really do add up. She mentions an example from John Gottman, the relationship researcher.
Yes, she refers to his work.
Yeah.
He talks about seeing his wife looking sad in the mirror. Instead of ignoring it or retreating,
He turned towards her
sadness, asked what was wrong. Brown highlights that as a key marble jar moment. A seemingly small act of noticing and responding with empathy that strengthens the relationship over time.
That turning towards idea feels really important. Being present, even when it's uncomfortable.
It's a recurring theme, definitely. And it ties right into her point about being in the arena versus being a critic on the sidelines.
Right, inspired by that Theodore Roosevelt speech.
Exactly. She emphasizes focusing on the people who are in the arena with you. The ones showing up, taking risks alongside you.
Not the people in the stands judging.
Not the critics, offering advice from a safe distance, unwilling to risk anything themselves. She realized the opinions that truly matter belong to those who'll support you no matter what. Basing your worth on sideline critics is just wasted energy.
That's such a freeing idea. Tune out the noise, focus on the real connections. Now, another key point. Shame resilience as a prerequisite for vulnerability. Why is it so critical?
Because that deep fear of what others think, the fear of judgment, criticism, ultimately shame, it's a massive barrier.
Stops us from putting ourselves out there.
Totally. If you're constantly worried about being exposed and found wanting, being vulnerable feels way too risky. She tells that story about the man at her talk.
The one who said he was bad at vulnerability, but really good at shame.
Yes. It sounds funny, but it highlights a real connection. Often, our inability to be vulnerable comes from a very well-developed capacity for shame.
So building resilience to shame is essential.
Absolutely crucial. Developing shame resilience, recognizing it, understanding it, navigating it healthily, creates the inner safety and courage needed to dare to be vulnerable. You really can't have one without the other.
And how does shame usually operate inside us? She talks about those inner critics, shame tapes, or gremlins.
Yeah, she describes them vividly, these intensely critical, negative internal messages. They fuel self-doubt, self-criticism, that feeling of not being good enough.
Like her writer's block example.
Exactly. All those tapes play. Your writing sucks, you'll be criticized. Real writers don't struggle like this. She points out these are often old recordings.
From childhood or culture.
Yeah, messages we absorbed somewhere along the way. They become these ingrained scripts that undermine our worth and stop us taking risks.
That relentless inner critic many of us know too well. And she makes a really crucial distinction between shame and guilt, right? They often get blurred.
Such an important distinction. Shame, she explains, is the feeling I am bad. It's about your core self being flawed.
Inherently wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
Guilt, on the other hand, is I did something bad. It's focused on a specific behavior or choice.
Like missing that friend's dinner.
Perfect example. Shame says, I'm a terrible friend, such an idiot. Leads to blaming, hiding. Guilt says, wow, that was inconsiderate of me. Leads to apology, making amends, changing behavior.
So guilt can actually be productive.
It can be a catalyst for positive change. Shame tends to be corrosive, isolating. Understanding the difference is huge.
It really is. Shame feels so much more total, isolating. Guilt is manageable.
Exactly.
She also talks about how shame can show up differently for men, mentioning the man box.
Yeah, the man box refers to those rigid societal expectations put on men.
Like, don't be weak.
Exactly. That core message. Never show weakness, never be vulnerable. She shares that powerful image of a college student literally crouching down to show how constraining it feels.
Wow.
And even when men are encouraged to be vulnerable, they often get criticized if they actually are. It creates this awful double bind.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't. A real no-win.
A very challenging place to be.
And she highlights a really sensitive area where vulnerability is essential but can trigger intense shame. Sex and intimacy.
Absolutely. Real intimacy, especially in romantic relationships, needs trust and vulnerability. But opening up there can trigger huge shame storms.
And it's not just about sex itself.
Often it's much broader. Body image issues, aging anxieties, money worries, different parenting styles.
Yeah.
All these sensitive areas can get tangled up in intimacy.
And require really vulnerable conversations.
Honest, loving, vulnerable conversations. They take significant courage from both people. Without that willingness, true intimacy struggles.
It really does seem to all circle back to self-worth, doesn't it? Believing you're worthy is foundational.
Completely. Daring greatly requires believing you're inherently worthy of love and belonging, period. Regardless of outcome or opinions.
And shame constantly contradicts that.
Exactly. It whispers, you're not good enough. Don't even try. Makes vulnerability feel terrifying.
And even when things are good, we can feel vulnerable. That foreboding joy idea is fascinating.
Yeah, that tendency, even in moments of great happiness, to brace for disaster. Like enjoying it too much will somehow jinx it.
Waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Right. But she offers a powerful antidote. Gratitude.
Just consciously practicing gratitude.
Intentionally focusing on and expressing gratitude in the joyful moment. It shifts your focus from fearing loss to savoring the present. Acknowledging what you have.
So instead of bracing for bad news, you actively appreciate the good.
Exactly. She shares a personal story about managing her anxiety that way. It's about rewiring your brain to notice and appreciate, not just anticipate problems.
That's a really practical tool. Now, another common defense, perfectionism. How is that linked to shame?
Perfectionism, she argues, isn't about healthy striving. It's a self-destructive belief system.
Driven by what?
Driven by the intense desire to avoid shame, judgment, blame, by trying to be flawless.
But it backfires.
Ironically, yes. The impossible pursuit of perfection sets you up for more shame and disappointment when you inevitably fall short.
Right.
It's a shield that ultimately harms you.
A shield that creates the very thing it's meant to protect against. She includes that interesting analogy from Nick about art.
Yeah, that's a great one. Nick suggests the world has perfectible things, business processes maybe, but then there's all the stuff that didn't fit.
The messy human stuff.
Exactly. The emotions, the experiences. And he says art is like that box of human imperfections. Since being human is imperfect, real art reflects that messiness. Perfectionism tries to deny that fundamental reality.
So trying to be perfect is trying to deny our humanity, basically. A losing battle.
Pretty much.
Another coping mechanism. Yeah. Numbing. How does that show up?
Numbing behaviors are anything we do to avoid feeling difficult emotions, inadequacy, anxiety, disconnection, often fueled by shame.
Can be obvious things like substance use.
Or seemingly harmless habits, compulsively checking email, endlessly scrolling social media.
Trying to buffer the discomfort.
Right. Anxiety and disconnection often drive this need to numb out, create a temporary shield.
But you end up numbing the good stuff too, right? Joy, connection.
Exactly. And she contrasts two groups dealing with anxiety, like around email. Group A tries to manage by being constantly on, checking emails late, phone by the bed.
Feeling they have to be always available.
Right. Group B takes a different approach. They address the root causes by aligning their lives with their values and setting boundaries.
Saying enough.
Yes. Operating from a place of worthiness that allows them to set boundaries around time, energy, attention. Prioritizing rest, connection, things that nourish them. It shows that crucial link. Believing you're worthy helps you set boundaries.
Setting boundaries feels key. Recognizing limits, protecting well-being. Requires self-compassion. And belief in your value, yeah.
She also mentions that binary thinking, seeing yourself as either a helpless victim or a controlling Viking.
Right, that rigid view. Either you're powerless and taken advantage of, or you have to be dominant and never show weakness to avoid being the victim.
No room for nuance.
None. And the problem is, it doesn't allow for human complexity. It leads to disconnection, distrust.
And she challenges it by asking,
how are you defining success? Does that constant control or constant helplessness actually lead to a fulfilling life? It forces you to question that limiting perspective.
really makes you think about whether those stances actually serve you. Now let's talk about some less effective ways we handle vulnerability. Floodlighting and serpentining.
Okay, floodlighting. That's oversharing personal stuff too early in a relationship or with too wide an audience.
Why do people do that?
Could be trying to soothe pain, test loyalty, maybe fast forward intimacy. But she says it usually backfires.
Makes people recoil, often, yeah. Leads to discomfort, awkwardness, more shame for the sharer. It's using vulnerability as an emotional discharge, not a bridge. Lacks that foundation of trust.
So sharing without the established trust and boundaries. Got it. What about serpentining? Love that word.
Such a great metaphor. It's about spending enormous energy dodging vulnerability instead of facing it.
Like that movie scene she referenced.
Exactly. Peter Falk yelling, "Serpentine!" while zigzagging frantically. It shows how futile and exhausting it is trying to outrun vulnerability.
How does it show up in life?
Hiding feelings, pretending, procrastinating on risky things, rationalizing, blaming others, even lying. All to avoid feeling exposed.
It's like this elaborate dance to avoid the very thing that could lead to growth and connection.
Exactly. So much energy wasted.
We've talked a lot about shame hindering vulnerability. What are practical steps to build shame resilience?
It's a process. First, critical awareness, learning to recognize your shame triggers, the physical signs.
Tuning in.
Yeah. And understand that difference between shame, I am bad, and guilt, I did bad. Practicing self-compassion is huge. Treating yourself kindly.
Like you would a friend.
Exactly. Reaching out, sharing shame experiences with trusted people, speaking about it helps defuse its power.
Takes away the isolation.
Right. And finally, critically examining those societal expectations and inner gremlin voices that fuel inadequacy. Challenging those negative narratives.
It's an active, ongoing practice of awareness and challenging old patterns.
Definitely.
Now, shifting slightly, she also talks a lot about the impact of culture, family, work, society on vulnerability.
Huge impact. Culture shapes our perceptions and comfort levels. She asks key questions to assess a culture's vulnerability friendliness.
Like, is vulnerability rewarded or punished?
Right. Is empathy valued? Is feedback seen as normal for growth? Or is the focus on avoiding discomfort?
Maintaining appearances.
Yeah. She argues that rehumanizing environments needs courageous leadership, moving away from seeing people as just cogs in a machine, acknowledging their worth, emotions, experiences.
And she gives examples of people and organizations that have tried to build cultures of courage.
Yes, like Sylvia, the event planner who felt like she was on the loser's list until she understood shame dynamics at work.
And Christine Day at Lululemon.
Right, fostering a culture of trust and risk-taking, valuing vulnerability, seeing mistakes as learning opportunities if you own them. They show how embracing vulnerability culturally leads to better, more human outcomes.
It really drives home that creating safe spaces isn't just nice, it's fundamental for success individually and collectively.
Absolutely.
Finally, she dedicates a really important section to vulnerability in parenting. What are her key insights there?
She emphasizes that our first stories about worthiness start in our families. So parents need to model vulnerability
Wow.
by acknowledging our own journeys, recognizing our own armor, and trying to take it off sometimes. Parenting from a place of enough, not scarcity, daring greatly in our own lives.
Showing, not just telling.
Right. And she shares those powerful definitions from kids about fitting in versus belonging.
Oh yeah, those hit hard. Belonging is being somewhere where you want to be and they want you there.
That unconditional acceptance is so fundamental, especially at home.
Definitely.
She shares a moving story about her daughter Ellen feeling like the other, and Brown just sitting with her in the dark, connecting it to Pema Chodron on compassion and shared humanity.
Simple presence.
And the story of Susan and her son, a wholehearted parenting moment where Susan owned a mistake, fostering open communication.
It shows good parenting isn't perfection.
It's presence, engagement, and being willing to be vulnerable yourself.
Exactly. It's about showing up authentically.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the ultimate takeaway? How does Brené Brown redefine success in the arena?
She brings it back powerfully. Victory in life's arena isn't about avoiding vulnerability or criticism. It's not about being flawless or pleasing everyone. It's about having the courage to take off the armor, to show up as you are, imperfections and all, to fully engage, even when it's uncomfortable, even with no guarantees. That willingness to be seen, be imperfect, and keep showing up.
That's the true courage. That's daring greatly.
Wow. So vulnerability isn't weakness to avoid. It's actually the birthplace, the source of courage, connection, a wholehearted life.
Beautifully put.
So you, our listener, as you reflect on this, think about the concepts from Brené Brown today. How might they resonate in your own arenas, your life, relationships, work?
Where might you be holding back, staying safe on the sidelines?
And what might happen? What could unfold if you chose even just a little bit to show up, be seen a bit more authentically?
Yeah, maybe what's one of small marble of trust, of vulnerability you could offer someone today?
This exploration, it's really just scratching the surface, isn't it? There's so much more to vulnerability, shame, resilience, wholehearted living.
Definitely a lifelong journey. We really encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. They're transformative.